Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the human lab rat. Today we're talking about the Russian sleep experiment. In the late 1940s, the Soviet Guard started making his way to the high security cell, and he would begin pressing a button that would release his voice to a microphone on the other side. And it would say, "Everyone lay down on the floor. Anyone that is caught standing would be shot on sight." The Soviets had been experimenting with a new trial gas, and they would begin decreasing the amount of gas that they had been filling in the room for the last 15 days. And they would start increasing the amount of levels of oxygen. As the Soviet would open the door, floods of water and blood would come pouring out of the cell. And as they walked in, they would realize that the water in the room was at least 4 inches tall. The scientists and the military personnel had been testing these inmates for the last 15 days, and for the last 5 days they had complete silence, and they would break their promise to check in on the inmates before their 30-day testing period. And when they had opened the door to check on the well-being of the inmates, they would come to a macabre scene that they were not ready for. Walking into a sight that could only be described as straight out of a horror film, the guard would immediately grab and place his hand over his mouth and run out of the room and begin vomiting, which would also issue and rush the other inmates and soldiers into the room, where they too would find the macabre sight inside the cell. On August 10th, 2010, on the internet site Creepypasta, a story that I had just described to you would be posted by the user Orange Soda. The story would be entitled The Russian Sleep Experiment, and this story would become a very huge success, not only becoming a story of urban legend, but would also be the inspiration for not only various other short films, but also short stories, novels, and so on. The story would be about a 1940s era Soviet Russia during World War II, about a science experiment gone horribly wrong. We'll be discussing the story today, and at the end just kind of deciding, is this story actually true? Or is it just a very well-written piece of fiction? In the late 1940s, the world was at war, and various countries during war were using different forms of speed and crank pills as a way to keep soldiers more alert and awake, to minimize the amount of times that soldiers were actually sleeping. The Germans would be capitalizing with this idea and would be issuing a drug called Perivitin. It was a very mild form of methamphetamine, and this was able to keep the Nazi soldiers awake and more alert. The American and British soldiers also were using this method as well, and were using a mild form of crank pills called Benzedrine, and this was also a way to keep the soldiers awake and more alert. And it should be said that around this time that American, British, and German soldiers were passing these pills out as if it were candy. The Soviets also wanted to capitalize with this idea as well, but they wanted to use a type of medication or gas as a way to keep soldiers more alert, more than just a few days at a time. The Soviets had recently been testing a trial gas, and everything up until this point had been a success. The only thing they had to do now was to find human test subjects to test this gas with. But being that the world was at war, the Soviets couldn't just use any of their soldiers, as every man counted. But also because that they were at war, the Soviets would have a large selection of prisoners of war at their disposal, and they would come up with an idea. They would trick and get some prisoners of war to volunteer to be test subjects for this trial gas. And they would decide amongst themselves they were prisoners of war, so they couldn't really get in trouble because no one would really know about it. And if they just died from the trial, no one's going to know about it at the same time. And they would actually find 5 prisoners of war to volunteer for this test. And how they would do that is they would approach these prisoners and tell them that if they were willing to undergo this trial experiment, that they would grant their freedom, even though the Soviets had no intention or plan of freeing these prisoners of war. The Soviet soldiers would also give the scientists a cell to observe these volunteers, and this cell would also be filled with microphones and also a 2-way mirror that would be about 5 inches thick. And they would equip this room with books, beds without bedding, and no toilet seat, but they would also give them a sink. They would also fill the room with enough dry food to last 30 days, as this testing trial would last about 30 days. The Soviets would then take the 5 prisoners of war and lead them to the cell and close the door. And it is at this point that they started releasing the trial gas into the closed off cell.